I'm Liam Kelly from the Institute of Asian Studies at University Brunei Darussalam. Professor Jonathan Rigg from the University of Bristol is visiting the university. He just gave a talk in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and then he sat down for a further conversation with Senior Professor Fan Leha from Shibi, the Sultan Hassan al-Bolkiah Institute of Education here at University Brunei Darussalam. And they talk further about his talk, which was entitled More Than Urban, Viewing Urban Poverty Through a Rural Lens. In this talk, Jonathan built on his many years of research on the rural areas of Thailand and rural-urban connections to basically argue that we can't understand the countryside or rural areas of Thailand today by looking at them from a rural perspective or looking at them from outside from an urban perspective, but you have to kind of look at them in these interconnected ways. And that was the gist of his talk and is a topic that he deals in much more detail in a new book called More Than Rural: Textures of Thailand's Agrarian Transformation. And so let's take a look at this conversation between these two professors, Jonathan Rigg and Fan Leha.
Yes. Hello, I am Fan Leha from Shibi, University Brunei Darussalam, and it's my great pleasure to have here with me Professor Jonathan Rigg, a professor of geography from the University of Bristol in the UK. And on behalf of the Institute for Asian Studies, it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to have this conversation with you, right? So Jonathan, right, I had actually I met you in 2010 when you were one of the keynote speakers at the second Engaging with Vietnam conference held in Hanoi through the introduction of Professor Phil Hutch from the University of Sydney then. And then, if I remember correctly, you talk about rural poverty and livelihood. And today, again, I think it was wonderful to listen to your talk given at the University Brunei Darussalam, entitled More Than Urban, Viewing Urban Poverty Through a Rural Lens, right? And so I'm very curious to see how you actually move from then to now. I know it's a big question, right?
Yeah. Well, if I can go even further back than 2010.
Sure, yeah.
So, when I started my academic career back in the early 80s, I worked in 2 villages in northeast Thailand, and it was very much a rural study. I mean, I was looking at rice variety selection strategy amongst farmers who were primarily semi-subsistence rice farmers. I mean, there was a little bit of mobility. They could get to the local town, but there wasn't very much, yeah? So the village, I kind of tried to come to understand the village in and of itself. And since then, I've kind of gone back to the village, and I've gone to other villages across Southeast Asia, so in Laos, Vietnam, in Thailand, also in Sri Lanka and Nepal. And I've increasingly realized that actually the village doesn't tell you very much, or it doesn't tell you as much as you need to know about livelihoods, that you need to kind of break the boundaries of the village. You need to go beyond agriculture, beyond farming, beyond the local, if you're to understand livelihoods in the local. And round about, I think, the early 2000s, I used an idea known as de-agrarianization, which was actually developed by a scholar of Africa called Deborah Brycerson. And I thought, I wonder if this is a nice way to think about what's happening in the places that I studied. So I suppose in that sense, my work has always been empirically driven. I've kind of I've talked to farmers, studied rural areas, tried to come to understand what they do and why. And then I think, right, what are the conceptual frameworks which might help me structure those experiences? And I suppose I've come to the urban, which was the title of the talk today, through that kind of career-long experience of seeing how I started conceptualizing rural life, kind of no longer captured what was going on, and then realizing, right, I've got to open up these boxes, the household, the village, the rural, farming, non-farming, and begin to bring in other things. And then I think they become understandable. So I suppose in the talk today, kind of that's where I am now. And maybe if I'm still alive in 10 years' time and I come back to UBD and I give another talk, it'll be different again. So in some senses, I mean, the last thing I'll say, I'm kind of playing explanatory catch-up. So I go and talk to the farmers and I think, wow, that's cool. How do I understand that? And I go away and I beaver away and I come up with an idea of what I think's going on, and I write a paper. But by the time the paper comes up, the farmers have moved on.
All right.
So then I go back and I think it's different, and then again I'm playing explanatory catch-up. So I always sort of feel that I'm in the wake of what's actually happening on the ground, and in that sense, my work is not really very prescient in the sense of looking over the horizon. It's more about just trying to catch up with the way that things are.
Yes, and as you said, the now and the before, the then, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and I am so intrigued by, some terms as well as some arguments you put forth in your talk just now. So, for example, you talk about two aspects of the urban. If I could put it rightly, the materiality of the urban and the values and practices attached to the urban. Would you mind to, commenting further on those two aspects?
Yes, by the materiality of the urban, I meant the urban, as we've come to understand the urban, the city. So the physical fabric of the city and all the infrastructure associated with it. And of course, if you drive out of a city, you get a real sense of the city then becoming suburban and in the end becoming rural. And you can see it and feel it and touch it and hear it, and it has a quality to it, which is a physical quality. It's
you can smell it.
And so on. And of course, where we then draw the line between the rural and the urban is partly tied to these things that you can actually pin down. I mean, it can be population density, it may be to do with infrastructure or services. There are these kind of data points that we could put together. So that's kind of what I meant about the materiality of the urban. And then I think there's another urban, which is the urban as a set of social practices and aspirations and behaviors and how we kind of engage with each other. And when people become, if you like, cosmopolitan or more urban, or when they become educated or when they've lived in urban areas, I think who they are changes and how they relate. And of course it means that when migrants come back to rural areas, they come back often with a whole bunch of kind of, if you like, baggage, which means that they've become different, they've become urban. And in that sense, and I think I said this in the talk today, you can be urbane in the sense of sophisticated in the rural. So if we think of urban not as the materiality of the urban, but actually urban as a quality which relates to other things, which doesn't have a spatial fixity, then of course it opens up the whole notion of where the urban begins and ends. And I mean, in Thailand, people like Duncan Macargo, for example, write about urban villages. So they're writing about peasants in the city.
Yes.
So he's kind of arguing that these people, although they're in the urban and maybe they're working in the urban and maybe they've been there for a long time, in terms of how they self-identify, they're still rural. How metropolitan people think of them is probably as Konbanok, rural people. And how they behave, what they eat, what they wear may be rural rather than urban. And ditto, people like Charles Keyes, Biff Keyes, talks about kind of cosmopolitan villages. So these are villages who are in many ways urbane. They've been abroad, they've got passports, they've travelled, they've seen the world, and yet they're in the rural. So I think both in their different ways, Duncan and Charles are kind of grappling with the same problem, which is how do we define these people? Where do we put them kind of categorically? You know, it's one lot is villagers who are in the urban, the other lot who are, you know, people who have been in the urban who are now back in rural.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they're probably still holding on to some urban aspirations, maybe, and practices. Yes, so I just wonder if I could go so far to suggest that, you know, if we could, whether or not we could apply the two aspects or the two urbans in talking about the rural. I mean, what I mean, like the materiality of the rural and the social values and aspirations attached to the rural. And if that is the case, and do you find the boundaries between those kind of very fluid and sort of unfixed? Am I right? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, in fact, in my new book, I write about the first rural, the second rural, and the third rural. But for the talk today, because I wanted to talk about the urban, I kind of switched it around and I talk about the first urban and the second. But you can do the same thing whether you're taking a kind of rural entry point or an urban entry point. So I think you're absolutely right. In the rural, these things are going on. And I think, I suppose what it does is it encourages us to break down these barriers, these binaries between rural and urban, farm and non-farm, and that sort of thing. And it makes us think about actually, the reality of living is between these categories, and therefore recognizing that and maybe trying to adjust some of our kind of frameworks to take account of it, I think is important. And I suppose that's what I was trying to get across in the talk today.
Yeah, but I think that's great. Yeah, because I did take note of the first urban to second urban and the third urban. Yes, I'm so glad that you talk about it here. And also, I think I am fascinated by a lot of data and charts, as well as empirical data that you show in the talk, and also your argument that actually there are many terminologies and existing theoretical frameworks that appear to be problematic or insufficient in explaining urbanization or urban space in Asian countries, particularly, let's say, the case of Thailand, even Vietnam, Indonesia, or China. Could you comment on some of those terms and concepts that you mentioned in your talk and in your book, like transition or modernization or industrialization, things like that?
I suppose in the talk I started with the work of Terry McGee and his kind of seminal work from the early 90s, where he made the point that he thought that urbanization was taking shape in a distinctive way in Asia, particularly in the densely settled wet rice growing areas of Asia. And so that would apply to Java, to the Chao Phraya Delta of Thailand, maybe to southern Vietnam, maybe the Red River in northern Vietnam, parts of China, and so forth, and India for that matter. And he said that because of this dense settlement, you could have, you found a kind of really interesting interlacing of rural and urban, farm and non-farm. And in fact, the kind of village I talked about, Bangkok Mayon, which is kind of in the Bangkok extended metropolitan region, the factories in that industrial estate, they were picking up workers daily from 100 kilometers away. So they were commuting 100 k's to work in the factory, then going back to their villages. So if you like, the tentacles of the effects of kind of factory work sort of seeping into a rural space in terms of what work people did, just extraordinary. And his argument, that Terry's argument, is that that's very distinctive, and that is partly maybe agroecological, so it's tied to the very high productivity. I mean, in Java, you can get 1,000 people per square kilometre living off the land. I mean, in Europe, you can't get anywhere close to that. So it means that you have such a dense population that you can kind of have industrialization. I mean, one of the points I was making, without de-peasantization. So people can be peasants and workers at the same time, in a sense, or at least families can adopt a peasantry-style livelihood and a worker-style livelihood at one and the same time. And therefore, the idea that people make a transition from peasant to worker doesn't follow. And of course, that is embedded in the kind of the European and North American transition experience, which is that actually you left rural areas and you went to cities and you occupied some, and you became workers. You lost your land. Maybe you were tenant farmers. Farms then became large kind of commercial concerns. They got bigger, and so on. And if you like, the peasantry then disappeared. But in Asia, you've got something different, at least at the moment, going on, which is, farms becoming more numerous, not less. And actually, the number of people who are farming remaining, surprisingly high, given the amount of structural transformation that's occurred in the economy. So that's kind of one of the puzzles which I was trying to kind of engage with in the talk today.
Yes, and also I think there are two terms that I pick up from your talk, peri-urban and desakota. So maybe I'm sure that a lot of people would be interested to know more about those terms.
I should say, I'd see myself mainly as a kind of rural geographer rather than as an urban geographer. So my way into kind of urban geography is, if you like, through rural. I've got there because I'm interested in rural, and it's kind of led me there. So I'm kind of cautious to present myself as some expert on urban geography. But, the difference between peri-urban and desakota, peri-urban is something which, if you like, it's the space around cities, So it's the periphery of the urban. So the point where the urban becomes the rural. I think what's different in Terry's work, which is desakota. Desa is Indonesian for village. Kota is Indonesian for town. So it's kind of village-town. And what he says is that actually the city doesn't, gradually make a transition through peri-urban into rural. Actually, these two things are, they coexist together. So the rural and the urban are actually interlocking in interesting ways, and livelihoods that are emblematic of rural and urban are also interlocking in interesting ways. So in a sense, although you might think, well, the peri-urban is just, desakota is just another word for peri-urban, I think he would say, no, it's not. These are different because they're actually underpinned by different processes. Since then, there's been work on extended metropolitanization, which is this sense of cities actually extending deeper and deeper into the countryside through this desakota sort of, what he calls kota desasi, which is the process of desakota creation. So, the words are Indonesian, so that's where he had his kind of moment, his light bulb moment. Thought, what's going on?
I think that's great. Yeah, we could. I'm sure that so you probably discuss that concept extensively in your new book.
There's a chapter on space, which is about how we, how we deal with space in the kind of rural-urban context as it's emerging in the book in Thailand. I'd like to think that the book is not just about Thailand. It's actually highlighting a set of things which are occurring elsewhere. So there are points in the book where I try and say, here's an example of this in Vietnam or in Malaysia or in Indonesia or wherever, or in China, to show that actually I think that the Thai experience, although of course it's distinctive, actually the bigger questions actually have resonances elsewhere.
Yeah, and also I'm really fascinated when you show, the farm sizes in different Southeast Asian countries, right? And also the fact that, and also you talk about questions of having access to land and whether or not it has any impacts on poverty reduction, and also the relationship between the rural and the urban when it comes to land access. Yes, so...
Yeah, I think that is... that's a really important question because my mostly highly cited paper, I don't know why, it's funny how these things happen, is a paper that looks at the links between poverty and land ownership, and it kind of makes the argument or suggests the argument that maybe the link between poverty and land they're becoming delinked, they're being pulled apart, that actually we can't now read land ownership is not a proxy for poverty in the way that it was. So in the past, you could go into a village and people with lots of land were rich and people with no land were poor and less land were middle and so on. Actually, you could use land ownership or access to land as a proxy or a surrogate for poverty broadly. I think that increasingly if you go into a village and you try and do that, it doesn't work. Yeah. So in that sense, land doesn't provide a kind of explanatory entry point or a surrogate to make us think about poverty and wealth and livelihoods and so forth. And in a way, you could say it's a statement of the blindingly obvious because, if you go into a village in the UK where I'm based at the moment, you wouldn't measure land ownership to work out who's rich and who poor. And actually, it's probably the other way around. People with land are poor and people without land are rich.
Probably, yes, yeah.
So, I wrote a paper kind of suggesting maybe something important there's going on. And I think one of the reasons probably why it's so highly cited is because I think there's a sense among some peasant studies scholars that that's profoundly wrong, that actually land is still the critical productive resource. And by making that argument, I was somehow denying, that politically it was problematic, that actually we need to not lose sight of the fact that land access and distribution of land is profoundly unequal in Southeast Asia. And that if I argue that it's not important, it means that the political need for land reform becomes,
sidelined, right?
Sidelined. So which I understand, and I think probably those two positions are not in contradiction. I think we can say that the link is fraying, and at the same time saying that for some groups it's still really important to recognise that the concentration of land in the hands of, corporations or very wealthy individuals actually is problematic. But anyway. But I think that's an interesting kind of question about agrarian change and the role of land.
Yes, I know that you're busy, maybe you have to go. Liam is giving me a signal, stop, but actually I have two more important questions that I love to ask, if you don't mind. Yes. Yes, so I have in my hands here Jonathan's latest book, Modern Rural Textures of Thailand's Agrarian Transformation, right? Published by the University of Hawaii Press.
Yep.
Yes. Wow, it's great, isn't it? Yes. So, if I'm sure that there are many important questions and issues that you have discussed in the book, but if you could only, give us one most important message or argument, what would that be?
Wow.
No.
Rush out and buy it right now.
Yes.
God, I haven't been asked that before. What's the one message? Maybe I say, because I wrote another book about, 15 odd years ago called More Than the Soil.
Oh, more than the soil now, more than rural.
And More Than Rural. And More Than the Soil was about how farming is, or rural livelihoods is about more than agriculture, more than farming. Yeah, so more than the soil. And More Than Rural is, in a sense, a kind of continuation of the argument, actually, that rural livelihoods are more than just rural. Yeah. So it's a kind of, in a sense, a continue. That was a slim book, and this one's a little bit longer. But anyway, and this one's about Thailand, whereas More Than the Soil was about the whole of Southeast Asia. But okay, the one thing I would say that people don't. I say people. Policymakers, multilateral organisations, some economists, I don't think have really understood the nature of rural Thailand. Yeah, and I think many of the things that multilateral agencies wish to do, get farmers to exit agriculture, what the government is trying to do, encourage farmers to, adopt the king sufficiency economy and all that sort of stuff, they fail because they haven't quite grasped what is going on in rural areas. So I think there's a kind of gap between what governments and multilateral agencies and others want the rural to look like and what it actually is. And I think that gap means that the policies don't have traction. And sometimes that's presented as meaning that farmers are somehow, they don't know what's good for them, they're a little bit dim or whatever it is. And actually, it's a gap in the knowledge of the people at the top, the policymakers. And I think it's a kind of, well, dare I say, it's a sort of urban view of, the peasant, of the rural.
Yes.
And, if they just got out a bit more and into the rural, then it would make sense. And I think a lot of the way that people present, there's a crisis in rural areas, there's a problem of this or a problem of that. When you actually get into the field, it's not a crisis and it's not a problem. It's only a problem because of the perspective that people take.
Yes. And that's exactly, as I said, if I may, I like to I'd like to invite you to talk a little bit about that argument that you've just made here. The shifting between seeing the rural and what is going on in the rural, identified by graying farmers, the absent youth, and left behind children. Seeing that as a problem to seeing it as strategy, as you powerfully and forcefully argued. Would that be one of the strong messages?
Yeah. And yes, those problems. So, left behind children, aging farmers, aging villages, absent youth, all that sort of stuff. These are all seen as part of a social malaise. But of course, if you look at it from a household point of view, actually it makes eminent sense. It all ties together very nicely and logically. And of course it's tough, but it's not, when you problematize something in that way, you make it a problem, then it becomes something to be tackled and all this sort of stuff. The other thing to say is that what farmers do, it's not an accident. It happens because of policy. So in other words, sometimes they say, oh, all the farmers doing all those sorts of things out there, what on earth are we doing? How do we stop them? But they're doing it because of the nature of work in rural areas, because of the way that, as people say, neoliberalism have created a type of employment which is precarious and uncertain and unstable and insecure. And actually, the reason why they leave children behind, why they don't sell their land, and so on, is kind of embedded in a series of decisions which are made by the World Bank and, multilateral organizations and governments, because they have a set of views about what is best.
Yes. Like the development framework, right?
Yeah.
And all those kind of things. And in the urban, becoming of the urban, right? There's so many, phrases that I have taken with me here. And of course, I said I love to talk with you more, but look at Liam, how has he ordering me to stop. Wow. Yes,
that's good.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Jonathan. And I look forward to meeting you again and having more conversation with you.
Now I know where you are.